Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second week of the 2020 Tyson Summer Seminar Series. My name is Suzanne Louie, and I work with the Science Communication team. I'd like to encourage you to log into YouTube. You'll be able to access the comment feature to say hello and introduce yourself and where you are from, either your institution, your program, or your location. You'll also be able to submit questions into the comments section to be answered at the end of the talk. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to recognize the burden carried by so many individuals from our multiple cultural crises, ongoing racial injustice, and the killing of Mr. George Floyd, the effects of climate change, and the impacts of COVID-19. The global pandemic, COVID-19, frames the presentation by this afternoon's speaker. This week, we are happy to welcome back to Tyson for a second time, journalist and science writer, Rachel Nuwer. Rachel spoke last summer about her investigative journalism research, which resulted in her award-winning 2018 book, Poached: Inside the Dark World of Wildlife Trafficking. We learned a lot. How poachers, typically at the bottom of the trafficking rung, seek basic economic support for their families. How restaurants in countries such as Vietnam offer popular menus of illegally trafficked animals, sometimes freshly killed tableside. How the consumption of wild animal parts for medicinal purposes is rooted in cultural beliefs about health, and how rangers in protected national parks attempt heroically to curb the poaching of large game. In a 2019 article, Rachel wrote, "Poaching destabilizes nations, disrupts ecosystems, and threatens biodiversity." She goes on to say, a recent study suggests still another consequence. Sometimes types of poaching may also accelerate climate change. In February of this year, wildlife trafficking took on additional meaning in our lives, as it was identified as a likely source of the COVID-19 outbreak. I wondered how Rachel's year had gone and reached out to ask if she could join us for an update of her work. Her talk this afternoon, Of Tigers and Trade, Wildlife Reporting in the Time of COVID-19, will undoubtedly bring us new insights into this complex relationship between humans and animals. Rachel received her bachelor's degree in biology and a master's degree in ecology. Her master's thesis was on illegal wildlife trade and natural resource use in Vietnam. Her research for that thesis was published in the scientific journal Oryx. She earned a second master's degree at NYU's Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program. She is an ongoing contributor to the New York Times, National Geographic, BBC, Scientific American, Smithsonian, Nature, and others. Welcome back, Rachel. We're so happy you could join us.
Thank you so much for
I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Great, so I have a presentation that I would like to share with you all. Let me see if I can figure this out. So today I wanted to talk to everybody a little bit about what I've been up to, as Suzanne said, since COVID-19 began. I've been immensely lucky. I have not gotten sick. No one in my family has, which has left me with a lot of time to stand at my desk in Brooklyn and try to find work. So normally my life as a journalist consists of finding stories, pitching those stories to editors, whether it be the New York Times or National Geographic, and then if I'm very lucky, getting to travel to report those stories, which is something that I just completely took for granted until March this year. So earlier this year, I was in the Amazon, deep in Brazil, you can see here, and my very last reporting trip was to Madison, Wisconsin, which I had a lot of great cheese curds, and I'm missing that now. Post-pandemic life has been a bit different. I get excited if I see a bird out of my window. I've been doing a lot of drinking, unfortunately. and making memes of my cat as I wait for editors to respond to my emails and hopefully give me work. The one thing I have been writing a lot about during this pandemic is the wildlife trade, which is, as Suzanne said, suddenly very relevant and is something that I just so happen to have written a book about in 2018. So I'd like to just give a very quick recap about what is the wildlife trade. I'm speaking specifically here about illegal wildlife trade. It's a major global contraband industry run by organized international criminal gangs. It's in profitability, it's in the multiple billions. That's just behind drugs, arms, and human trafficking. Yet, unlike those other three forms of crime, wildlife trade receives relatively scant resources to combat it. This is really an international problem. Virtually every country on the planet is affected in some way, whether as a source of species, a transit through which illegal species travel, or a source of demand for those animals. And some are all three. A few of the impacts, there's a few sort of poster children of the wildlife trade, rhinos being one of them. Since 2013, over 1,000 rhinos have been poached every year, mostly for their horns. And these data are just in South Africa alone, but this is also happening in Mozambique, Namibia, Kenya, and other countries. Since COVID began, 6 black rhino, a critically endangered species, have been poached in Botswana, and rangers think that that is connected to a lesser presence of rangers in the field, and also a lesser presence of tourists and trophy hunters. If there's not eyes around, then poachers can sneak in. Elephants, of course, are also decimated by illegal wildlife trade. There's been a steep increase in elephant poaching since about the mid-aughts, with an over 30% decline in savanna elephant populations across Africa, and that's primarily for their ivory. And then there's all the other species. Pangolins, which we've heard a lot about in the news lately, I'll get to that later, are very, very sought after in the wildlife trade. They're extremely profitable at the moment in China, in Vietnam, to the point that traders are beginning to traffic more in pangolin scales than in ivory because they can make more money. A recent paper found that 2.7 million pangolins are poached in Africa alone each year, and that's to be trafficked predominantly to Asia. They're sought after for their meat, but also for their scales that are used in traditional medicine. And it doesn't just end with rhinos, tigers, elephants, pangolins, the species we're all familiar with. There are virtually thousands of species that are caught up in wildlife trade, and that's legal and illegal. A science paper that came out very recently estimated that 5,600 vertebrate species are traded in some way, or that's 1/5 of the world's known vertebrates. Why are species poached? Why are they legally traded as well? There's a number of reasons. A lot of people like to eat wild meat. Here's a photo I took in Vietnam at a restaurant. All of these animals in Vietnam are illegally served, but that doesn't stop them from appearing openly on menus because there's very little enforcement. And wild meat also takes the form of legal food, for example, venison in the US. Just like here in the West, in Asia, people want to look nice, and one way of doing that is, instead of, say, buying a diamond, buying an ivory brooch. Ivory is very, very popular as a bracelet or necklace in China. Tiger teeth and claws are also fashioned in pendants. Rhino horn, as you can see on the bottom of this photo, is turned into bracelets and also necklaces. Wildlife are also used as exotic pets. We'll talk more about pet tigers in the US later, but this is another form of potential transmission of zoonotic diseases with the pets we bring into our homes. So what does all this have to do with COVID? Suzanne hinted at this earlier, but wildlife trade is believed to be at the heart of this pandemic. Wildlife trade promotes the transmission of zoonotic diseases, which can lead to something like this COVID outbreak. So I want to talk a little bit about how the trade chain works and why that trade chain promotes the transmission of diseases. Here I am in, I think, 2016 with a professional pangolin poacher in rural Vietnam. So this poacher, his name's Tom Ho, he goes out into the jungle and traps animals. Here he is checking one of his traps. Thank goodness we did not catch anything while I was with him. But when he does catch an animal, he bags it up like this, and he calls somebody from the next biggest city near his village to come get it. So that guy will show up on a motorbike, take the bagged animal. Those bagged animals will be consolidated and taken to the next biggest city, perhaps Ho Chi Minh City, or even as far north as China. And during this process, you know, animals are very, very stressed out, of course. They're not being fed or watered. Oftentimes they get injured. Here's 2 pangolins that were rescued from the trade, but subsequently died of their injuries. And as these animals are being stressed, they're shedding viral particles and they're mixing. It's not like just pangolins are transported together. And this is creating just a perfect concoction for the spread of disease. Once they do reach markets, they're often sold alive. I took this photo in Jakarta in Indonesia. You can see the top shelf contains owls and rabbits. Then moving down, we've got cats and macaque monkeys. On the very bottom under the cat, there's even fruit bats hanging. And you know, these animals are just, they're pooping on top of each other. Again, just an absolutely perfect recipe or laboratory for transmission of viruses or for mutation of a novel virus. Oh, and here's the same market in Indonesia where bats are sold. And here's a gentleman who is slaughtering a live bat on the floor. Again, very unhygienic. You know, there's not hand washing stations or anything like that. So what do we know about COVID-19? We actually don't know for sure that it came from the wildlife trade, but every expert I've spoken to, and I've spoken to many since this happened, believes this is almost certainly the source. For SARS, for example, that happened in the early 2000s, it came from bats, and then it jumped to civet cats, and then it finally was transmitted to humans. MERS, another coronavirus, came from bats, was transmitted to camels, who then transmitted it to humans. Right now, the thesis is that, or the hypothesis is that the novel coronavirus came from a wet market in Wuhan. 31 of 33 samples tested at that market originated from the wildlife section of the market. And this is a poster from one of those stores, and it's advertising feet, blood, intestines, and other parts from over 70 species that are kept alive. So again, just a perfect recipe for viral transmission. So the pangolin hypothesis, we don't know what species this coronavirus came from, and or if it used an intermediary species from that host before it jumped to humans. But one early hypothesis that came out, I think in April, and you know, I was getting so many text messages from people saying, Rachel, did you see this pangolin thing? Was that the coronavirus came from pangolins. Again, pangolins are highly traded in China and Vietnam. However, the jury is still out about where it actually came from. Scientists have found that this new coronavirus has 96% similarity with a horseshoe bat found in China, but just 90% similarity to a pangolin. So pangolins definitely are not definitively the host. We're still looking for that. So where does that lead us? We really need to profoundly change our relationship to wildlife and also to the environment wholesale. Many researchers have found evidence that altered environments, especially deforestation, increases the chances of zoonotic disease transmission and emergence. When forests are cut in South America, for example, instances of dengue, malaria, and Zika go up. The reason is it just creates more of an interface for people, their livestock, and wild animals that they don't normally meet to all come in contact, and for the chance of viral transmission to occur. In terms of wildlife, though, there has been some encouraging developments. So China immediately put a temporary ban on all consumption of wild terrestrial mammals shortly after the coronavirus hit. Just last week, they uplisted pangolins, Chinese pangolins only. Unfortunately, there's 8 species of pangolins, but at least 1 species of pangolins now in China is uplisted to have the same level of protection as pandas, which is great. Another thing they've done is they've removed pangolin scales from the pharmacopoeia of the country, which means they're no longer recommended as a traditional medicine product. Before that happened, pangolin scales were actually legal to prescribe from certain hospitals and pharmacies. Now, they haven't made pangolin scales illegal, but at least this is one very positive step. Looking at the big picture, though, we really need to make some seriously profound changes in the way we treat animals. A lot of scientists are proposing an end to wildlife trade as we know it. This would probably require a new international treaty, new legislation all across the board. And of course, there would be carve-outs for indigenous communities, for forest communities who depend on wildlife. What we're really talking about here is the exploitative commercial scale wildlife trade that moves animals from the forest to urban places, that creates this perfect petri dish for transmission of disease. Banning trade is going to take a lot, though. It's going to take a fundamental political shift and cultural shift, for example, in China, where animals are written into law as being basically resources for people to use. There's also less interest in other countries, for example, in doing this. For example, Vietnam at first seemed to be very positive, moving in a positive direction toward also issuing a similar ban as China. However, nothing has happened since April 1st, and conservationists are now afraid that with the coronavirus beginning to die down in terms of the emergency in Vietnam, that people are going to just kind of forget about it and walk away. Indonesia, another country with extremely high levels of wildlife trade, also has done very, very little in terms of moving to close that trade. But as sources told me, unless we profoundly change the way we do this coronavirus is just going to be one in a series. And the next coronavirus or the next zoonotic disease that comes up might just be the one that kills most people who become infected. So we're very much playing with fire here. Yeah, so my concluding remark here is let's avoid the contagion future. Because if not, it's not a question of if, but when. So shifting gears ever so slightly now, I'd like to talk about another aspect of coronavirus that many people across the US and the world are probably familiar with, which is the Tiger King phenomenon. We were all stuck at home, unable to socialize in March, and Netflix dropped this documentary series called Tiger King, which just turned into a runaway hit. Now, the gentleman pictured here, his name's Joseph Maldonado Passage, better known as Joe Exotic. And I actually heard about him back in fall 2018 when I received a press release from the US Department of Justice about the upcoming federal prosecution of Joe Exotic. Now, a quick run through for those who haven't watched Tiger King. Joe Exotic is a self-described gun-toting gay Oklahoma redneck. He's a real wild character. He ran for president in 2016, but what really distinguishes Joe is that he was previously the largest private tiger owner in the US. And his specialty was speed breeding tigers for tiger cub petting sessions, and also to sell those tigers. And a lot of people, a lot of conservationists and animal welfare advocates did not like this. One of them being this woman, Carol Baskin. Carol Baskin is a former big cat breeder who realized back in around 1998 the error of her ways, that she was hurting big cats rather than helping them by breeding them and keeping them in captivity. And she's made it her mission to stop people like Joe Exotic and change legislation that allows big cats to be kept in the US. Now, when Carol Baskin started messing with Joe Exotic's business by suing him for infringement of her trademark upon other things, he didn't like that. Eventually, he tried to hire a hitman to kill Carol Baskin. He was convicted of 2 attempted murder for hire in federal court in Oklahoma for spring 2019. So Joe Exotic is now behind bars. I looked into all this. I researched all this for a big story I did for Long Reads called The Strange and Dangerous World of America's Big Cat People. I also turned this into a podcast, and those stories actually dropped the week before Tiger King. So I found myself quite caught up in this and just inundated in questions about what actually goes on behind the scenes, and what the story actually is for tigers, because the Netflix documentary Tiger King is really more of a entertainment value, reality television version of life than a factual journalistic documentary. So I will walk you through the 101s of big cat ownership in the US and why it is such a big problem. So the origin story, back in the 1970s and the 1980s, zoos in the US began advertising what they called zoo babies. And this is every spring, they'd have the tigers and the lions breed, and then families could come and have photos taken with the cubs. Now, as they're breeding these animals, they're not keeping all these animals. They can't, keep 20 tigers or however many they breed at their facilities. So they started auctioning the babies off when they were too big to play with. Eventually, people caught on that this might be a good moneymaker, and people like Jack Hanna would come on to talk shows, handling these animals as if that's perfectly fine, like they were cats or dogs. Things really took off with magician shows featuring big cats. One of them being Siegfried and Roy. That was definitely the biggest one. And this continues today. Just animals, big cats put in positions that are unnatural and that make it look like it's totally fine to cuddle and snuggle with them, and also just puts it in people's mind, this idea that, oh, I want to be like these celebrities. I want to also hold a big cat. Maybe even I want to own a cat. So there are actually more captive tigers in the US today than there are remaining in the wild. So we actually do not know how many captive tigers live in backyards, basements, truck stops around the country, but experts put the number over 4,000 because that's the number of wild tigers remaining. And this phenomenon really is fueled by cub breeding, breeding big cats to produce cute little cubs for photo petting sessions. I dropped by Joe Exotic's former zoo during my reporting, and I did one of these cub petting sessions just to see what it was like. It's not great. The cub is put into a small room and often passed around to people all day, every day. Cubs often have ringworms. I mean, now we know that tigers can get coronavirus. In this case, the cub was right on the cusp of becoming too big to handle, and the cub actually playfully attacked my producer and bit him, and he had this big red welt on his arm. So it can be dangerous, especially for children. It's very bad for the cub. But anyway, so this process of breeding cubs produces all of these tigers. They very quickly are too big to safely handle. I mean, you cannot play with a 40-pound tiger cub. And at that point, zoo owners or roadside zoo owners need to offload these extra cubs to anyone who will pay. So who on earth would buy these extra cubs? I kind of see these people broken down into three distinct groups. One of them are people just looking to show off, people looking to become unique, like the guy with the tiger, the lion woman, almost like you might buy a fancy car if you're having a midlife crisis. So the macho types. Another type of owner, this is a woman I met in South Carolina. Her name is Deb, and she had a pet lion named Elsa and a pet mountain lion named Charlie. She took really good care of them, but they had completely taken over her life. She was paying like $10,000 a year for meat to feed these two animals. Her veterinary bills were just as steep. She really had, fashioned a cage of her own living by adopting these animals. But she explained it to me by saying, she'd just grown up loving lions, and she always wanted to have her own pet lion. So some people just really, really love these animals and want to be close to them. And finally, there's a third group of people that would get a big cat, and that's those with a misplaced desire to help conservation. So they think, okay, tigers are endangered in the wild. So if I get a tiger, I can help tigers because I'm making more tigers. In fact, this is not at all true. Tigers behind bars in the US have zero conservation value. For one, you cannot reintroduce a half domesticated tiger back into the wild. That tiger is not going to have any natural fear of humans. It's going to attack people, and it's also going to starve because it doesn't have any hunting skills. More than that, however, there are 6 subspecies of tigers in the wild, whereas here in the US, virtually all of our tigers are completely mixed. They are mutts. They are what's called American tigers. So they don't actually have genetic value for any breeding programs for the wild either. So why is this problematic? Why don't we just, let everybody have their big cats if they want them? Well, for one, big cats are very, very difficult to keep properly. These are animals that often have hundreds of square miles in terms of their natural habitat, and they also eat a ton. As I said, that woman Deb, the big cat owner Deb, she spends up to $10,000 a year on meat. Oftentimes people just can't afford that. Cats are kept in tiny cages. They get sick. People can't afford veterinary bills. They go hungry. And the USDA is supposed to is in charge of the Animal Welfare Act, and people do get cited and fined, but it doesn't really lead to any change. Like Joe Exotic Zoo, for example, had hundreds of citations, but nothing ever really happened. Big cats are also a public safety threat. So some people might remember the Zanesville massacre in 2011. This incident, it was really a tragedy, but it brought into light just how problematic big cat ownership is. A guy named Terry Thompson, an exotic animal owner, he opened the cages to almost all of his animals, releasing 18 tigers, 17 lions, 3 mountain lions, plus bears, baboons, and wolves. And then he shot himself. He committed suicide. And the police were completely overwhelmed, and they wound up having to execute all those animals because there's no other way to safely contain them. Zanesville was an extreme example, but there are other people out there who are capable of another Zanesville. And there are also every year reports of people being maimed by pet tigers. And it's oftentimes children who get hurt and even killed by people's pet tigers. Finally, there's one more reason why we should really consider banning big cat ownership, and that is the Asia connection. This is a little convoluted, but it's quite powerful when you put it together. So as I said, we don't know how many tigers are in American backyards right now. In Asia, on the other hand, in China, there are vast tiger farms where big cats are raised like pigs or livestock for their parts. This is a really shady area. Tiger bone is not legal in China. I won't get into all the legislation there, but there are thousands of big cats on farms in China, in Laos, in Vietnam, and in a few other Southeast Asian countries. Now, the US State Department has made it a priority to shut those farms down because they serve absolutely no conservation value and instead just perpetuate demand for big cats and their parts, which also encourages poaching of big cats in the wild. However, when US diplomats go to Asian diplomats and say, hey, we'd really like you to shut down those tiger farms, they just turn around and say, well, okay, look at the mess in your own backyard. Like, you don't even know how many tigers there are in the US. So how can you presume to tell us what to do with our animals? Like, at least we know how many we have. So by actually getting a handle on the big cat situation here in the US, we can potentially help this shut down tiger farms and save tigers in the wild. So what can actually be done about this? The goal here is to ban big cat ownership. And there's actually a piece of legislation called the Big Cat Public Safety Act. It was being heard in the House before coronavirus hit. And this is something that's been championed and spearheaded by Carol and Howard Baskin, the sort of stars of Tiger King. And it's actually really got a chance to pass, I think, at this point, maybe partly because of the notoriety of Tiger King, but also just because of just the support that the Baskins and others have worked to garner in Congress and in the Senate. One of the great things about this is it's a bipartisan supported bill. You know, many Republican lawmakers aren't necessarily signed on to the tree hugging, like let's say big cuddly cats part of this, but they do respond very well to the public safety side of things. So there's a former police officer, for example, who's helping to champion this bill. And if he gets any pushback, he just says, oh, well, you don't like supporting the police. And that usually gets Republican lawmakers to quickly say, okay, you know, I'm going to support this. So there's actually a good chance that this bill could pass. And why is that needed? That's needed because currently we do not have a federal law governing big cat ownership in the US. There's laws here and there about, you know, the Endangered Species Act or the Animal Welfare Act, but there's no just blanket law about can you or can you not have a pet lion, for example. About 2/3 of states have some sort of prohibitions about ownership. 10 states, you can just pay, you know, $30 for a license from the USDA, and then you can go get your pet tiger. And 4 states, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Oklahoma, have 0 laws whatsoever about big cats. So it might be harder for you to go get a dog at the Humane Society than it would for you to get a tiger. So that is something that the Baskins and others are hoping to change soon. This bill, by the way, would ban all public contact with big cats. So there would be no more cub petting, which would really get at the heart of the industry, what's perpetuating the industry. And eventually there'd be no private big cat ownership at all. So that is my talk, and I would love to take some questions. Thank you all so much for tuning in.
All right, Rachel, I hope you are imagining enthusiastic applause right now. You can just sit there and hear it in your mind. I want to go on to questions. Let's start with possible sources of COVID-19, just questions around that, sort of going back to the beginning of your talk. We have one that says recent research has shown that bats are not any more responsible for spillover events than other species, mammals, question mark. Do you have a sense for public perception of bats versus other species for spillover?
Yes, I'll say that I'm not familiar with that research, but I'd love to take a look. I have seen research about why bats are such good candidates, but I mean, really, it's neither here nor there. All animals could lead to spillover events, especially those more closely related to us, like mammals. I've seen a lot of pushback, however, and vilification of bats everywhere from incidents from China to Peru, in which people are saying, you know, like, let's go kill bats. Let's just get rid of these species. And there was also some pushback in terms of pangolins when they were circulating as possible hosts of this coronavirus, saying, oh, well, let's just get rid of all pangolins, which of course is not the way to go. The solution, as with everything, I'd say is education and also just enforcement to make sure people aren't going out there to shoot bats. I think the incident in Peru, some people were trying to light a cave on fire, for example.
One person has asked, are people who participated in or who bought from the illegal wildlife trade becoming more supportive of making wildlife trade illegal after this pandemic?
That's such a great question. And I think the jury is really still out, but there are lots of signs that people are like, whoa, you know, on social media in China, there has been tremendous backlash against wildlife trade, you know, legal and illegal, just saying, you know, we don't need this. Why are we still doing this? We can't let, you know, the greedy few drag the rest of the nation and the planet down. I've talked to people in Vietnam who think that many people are now afraid to go eat that pangolin. You know, they're hesitating. They're not going to as readily go out and order the bat or the pangolin. Whether that lasts, we'll see. You know, people have short memories.
Along those lines, someone has asked, would you say that broadcasting shows like Tiger King bring awareness to issues about wildlife trafficking or further promotes big cat ownership?
That's a great question too. I would say that shows like Tiger King really did very little for conservation. That wasn't the goal of Tiger King. Tiger King clearly, the filmmakers set out to make a purely entertainment, no educational value reality television show. Unfortunately, when they approached people like the Baskins, they told them, hey, we're making the blackfish of big cats, which in my mind is quite deceptive and unethical. I mean, at least it's opened up the conversation now. Like perhaps some people will say like, hey, wait a minute, what's up with that cub petting thing? Let me like do a little more research. So it's opened up the conversation, but at the same time, it might also have taken efforts a step back in terms of encouraging people to seek out cubs for selfies, to be interested now in getting their own pet tiger cubs. So Joe Exotic's former zoo, when Oklahoma opened for post-coronavirus recently, was completely flooded with people lining up to get selfies with tiger cubs. And there's reports of, cubs being passed around for 12 hours a day.
What would happen to these big cats if the bill were passed that you spoke about?
Good question. So they would be rehomed to reputable actual sanctuaries, not to places like Joe Exotics, where they would be spayed and neutered and humanely live out their lives until old age. One place is Big Cat Rescue in Tampa, the Baskin Sanctuary. They don't do any breeding. People are not allowed to touch cats. And all of their cats come from owners who have basically dumped the cats on them because they can no longer take care of them or don't want to take care of them, or from confiscations from illegalities. And there's quite a few of these sanctuaries, and they're constantly overwhelmed with people just dumping these animals on them.
Do you think that the relaxing of restrictions on wolf and bear hunting in the United States will affect the level of support and engagement in conservation?
That's a tough one. So I haven't looked at exactly what the restrictions were. I was seeing headlines a couple days ago about bear cubs, but I'm not comfortable speaking toward that question, having not looked into it myself. Trophy hunting in general, it does genuinely bring money to conservation. Much of our public lands are protected on the basis of trophy hunting historically, but I cannot say more than that just because I haven't looked into this most recent development.
Another one asks, even if big cat ownership is made illegal, how do we take away the cultural value that has been assigned to owning big cats, which could push people to pursue sketchier means of obtaining these cats?
Well, I will say that, yeah, of course, like with every law that's ever passed, there's people who break the law. I think though, like people like Deb Pierce, who I met in South Carolina, if she knew that this was illegal, she wouldn't go get a lion. So there's people who will respond to a law and just say, okay, it's illegal. That said, it's really hard to hide a 500-pound predator. There was a story a few years back of a guy in Harlem, New York, where I am right now, going to the hospital and saying, hey, I got bit by a pit bull. And the doctor took one look at his arm and there's these two giant gouges out. And he's like, that's not a pit bull. And the police wound up going to his house and they found, a 500-pound tiger there. So I think that, banning big cat ownership would begin to phase it out. There would be some bumps, of course, but honestly, it's not like a huge cultural issue. There's a niche group of people who are really into this, and some of them, for example, would be allowed to keep their animals as if they can take care of the animals, and the animals can live their lives out. They just wouldn't be able to keep getting more animals.
This is a tough one. How long will it possibly take for countries to crack down on wildlife trade?
Oh, yeah. If only I knew the answer. Yeah, nobody knows. I mean, to me, if countries can't crack down on wildlife trade after this pandemic, like I don't know that it's gonna really happen. Like I don't know what else it would take to get policymakers to finally take this issue very seriously. And I mean, countries are cracking down on wildlife trade. There's a lot of great efforts in the US, in Africa, in China, in many, many places. but just more is needed. And like I said in my presentation, I think we really need a fundamental shift about how we even go about trading wildlife commercially.
What do you think of places who take in big cats who were rescued from places like a circus?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think as long as it is a legitimate sanctuary, that's amazingly commendable. I mean, big cats are just money holes. You know, it costs a lot to take care of them properly. The problem, however, is there's a lot of phony sanctuaries out there, places that just slap the word sanctuary or whatever in front of their name, but are actually just places that breed big cats and do the cub petting.
Yeah, and I want to say that person followed up with such as an actual organization that takes care of these animals as they
That's
can't be released into the wild after they're
right.
rescued.
I mean, it's extremely commendable. It's not something that you're going to make money off of. It's something that people do just out of love for these animals and trying to do the right thing.
Sorry, my screen moved. I was
No
catching
worries.
my questions. How does zoonotic diseases beginning with exotic wildlife compare to those that begin with domesticated animals like swine or bird flu?
Oh, it's a good question. You know, I am not a wildlife disease expert or an epidemiologist. I don't know. That's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. But yeah.
Okay, and this is something that I know you talked about last year, and maybe you can, you can sort of shed some light on it some more now. I have learned that some poachers or traders act because they need to make a livelihood, as
Mm,
most are from poorer communities. How do you factor this in or eliminate the trade without hurting those individuals?
right. Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, poverty is a huge driver of wildlife trade. A lot of people are poaching not because they want to or they hate animals, but because they really need the money. I'll never forget talking to a ranger in Kruger National Park in South Africa, and he was talking about catching a poacher and saying, you know, why are you doing this? And the guy said, well, because we're eating grass back home. Like his family literally only had grass to eat. So really, this can't just be, you know, eliminate demand, arrest poachers, like throw them in prison. Like putting poachers in prison is not the answer. Figuring out ways to actually support people's livelihoods and alleviate poverty, which I know is just such a huge task. But you know, at the same time, laws are laws, and we shouldn't just allow people to go poach those black rhinos to make a buck. We need to find other ways to help them.
And this is a related question. Are there any economic policies that you know about that are put into place here or in other countries to support people that are trading animals to survive?
Mm. I mean, a lot of programs are hiring former poachers because they often have like the richest, most in-depth knowledge about a particular place. It's where they grew up. It's, you know, it's their profession. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to make sure that fees from, say, trophy hunting, from ecotourism, from donations also go into communities that surround national parks and wilderness areas, and you know, invest in things like schools and hospitals and education of youth. So I don't know that that would be an economic policy of a country itself. That's more of, you know, various parks and one-off programs and conservation organizations and companies. And you know, there's also companies that specialize in sustainable green development that are really getting going in Africa. Yeah, there's options, but we definitely need to do a better job.
Can you say a little bit about how making it illegal to own big cats, such as tigers, may make it more enticing to own them?
Yeah, I mean, definitely in wildlife trade, part of the allure, at least in Asia, is to own something illegal and to flaunt the law by saying, you know, look at this rhino horn I have. It's so expensive and also it's illegal, which means like I'm such an important person that the laws don't apply to me. Um, Perhaps that mentality applies to some people here in the US, but I think part of why many people want to own a tiger or a lion is to show off. And, you know, if you're showing that animal off, eventually you're going to show it off to the wrong person and they're going to turn you in. Um, yeah, again, it's very hard to hide these giant predators.
There is scientific criticism to the benefits of reducing wildlife trade to conservation and pandemics. Have you heard these and can you comment?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of debate and discussion going on now in the conservation community about what reforms really need to be made. Whether that's installing hand washing stations at wet markets, or a complete ban on like all consumption. Although I will say that I haven't heard anyone argue for a complete and total ban on like entirety of wildlife trade. Like nobody is arguing that we should end deer hunting or end sustainable trade of crocodiles or things like this. There's definitely going to be exceptions, and nobody's arguing that we need to make it illegal for communities, especially indigenous communities who depend on wildlife, to stop trading it. It's more this commercial scale exploitative trade. I don't think anybody has the answer about where we need to fall on that spectrum of, trade free for all, no trade. I think a happy medium somewhere in between. But the problem with wildlife trade is it's just such an immensely complex subject, and there's just so many unknowns. Everything from, how many pangolins are left, nobody even knows. To why people want certain animals, what would change their minds, things like this. So not a very clear answer, but the problem is we just don't know. But there is a very lively debate going on about what the future should look like.
Clearly you have tapped into a topic that has only increasing relevance in our life. Could you talk a little bit about how you first became interested in wildlife
Oh,
trafficking?
sure.
Wildlife trafficking?
Oh, wildlife trafficking.
Yeah.
Well, I first became interested in wildlife just growing up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, like having lots of pets, going outside a lot, interacting with all the ecosystems of that awesome, diverse environment. Wildlife trafficking, I think there's just a part of me that's sort of attracted to the darker side of human nature, to crime, to yeah, that sort of thing. And I also just wanted to find a niche where I could hopefully make some sort of positive difference. And to me, the killing of endangered species and other animals was just, it was something that I couldn't take my eye off of. It was something that really bothered me. And at the time when I got into this, which was around 2010, there was actually very little relatively being written about it. There was a story here or there about elephant poaching picking up, but it wasn't like it is now, where people just are like, oh yeah, wildlife trade, pangolins, okay. So, I'm really happy to have contributed my small part, I hope, to getting that message out.
All right. You have written pieces that highlight how animals like tigers are much beloved in the West, and this is something that you said, but these creatures pose a threat to the livelihoods and lives of people who must live with them in countries like India.
Mhm.
Do you think that our misplaced affection and breeding of these animals like tigers may obscure the real difficulties and solutions needed for those countries?
Mm. Yes, India is a really interesting case study. I might not get the statistic exactly right, but I think they are home to 70% of the world's remaining wild tigers, around like 3,500 animals or so. India has done a really amazing job with wild tiger conservation, but as tigers come back, as they build that population up, again, tigers have a range, and young tigers or old tigers that are starving get pushed out of those national parks, and they're starting to come in conflict with rural Indians. And in some cases, there's livestock mortalities or even human deaths. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but I think at least 100 people are killed a year by tigers in India. And the thing is, once a wild tiger loses its fear of people, which is a natural fear, but once it realizes, as one tiger conservator or scientist told me, that these like awkward bipedal monkeys are really easy to catch, that tiger will oftentimes go on to be a man eater, and it will just start predating on people. And when that happens, you have to get rid of that tiger. There's no question about it, because if you allow that tiger to continue killing people or livestock, local populations are going to turn against tiger conservation, and they're just going to turn against conservation wholesale. There's been reports of, rangers being attacked, ranger stations being set on fire because people just freak out and they're like, why is this tiger allowed to still go on killing us? And the reason that the government often delays on killing those man-eating animals is because of a growing animal welfare movement among urban Indians. And also, here in the West, but very, very, very much so in urban India. There was a recent issue with this tiger named Avni, and she became just this huge sensation. I think she killed like 20 something people by the end. But in Mumbai, they kept taking out lawsuits against the government to stop the tiger's killing, or to stop the killing of the tiger. And in the meantime, she's just predating. So in India, there is a very, very complex issue going on with people getting too attached to a specific animal and saying like, all tigers should live, rather than kind of keeping their eye on the conservation message of the species. Like, we can't let one animal live to the detriment of the entire species. So yes.
Another person asks, do you see the issues of the illegal wildlife trade as ones that should be solved by governments or international organizations?
Both. I think everybody needs to solve this issue. It has to come from governments for sure. International organizations can help direct that. We need nonprofits to pick up the slack, because oftentimes governments just aren't putting the resources or capable of putting the resources into this. And just also, every one of us can do our part to solve this issue in our own way.
Thank you. I'm just looking for a few more questions that have come in here. Looking down my list.
Yep.
How common is it for large cats to start predating on people?
It's extremely rare. I mean, like I said, there's 3,500 odd tigers in India. 100 people, give or take, get killed a year. It's very, very rare. But the problem is, the more tigers we have, the more it's going to happen. And when it does happen, it really kind of seizes the imagination and taps into, I think, this sort of primal horror we have of being something's meal. Like elephants, for example, kill way, way more people in India than tigers do. I can't remember how many times more, but significantly more. But nobody's out there like, kill the elephants. Yeah, so once it happens, it needs to be nipped in the bud.
You mentioned we can do our part as well. What are some of the things you suggest that we can do to help?
So many things. Well, one thing in terms of, say, big cats is just call in and support the Big Cat Public Safety Act to your representative. You can go onto Big Cat Rescue's website, and I think they have just like one of those little like forms you fill in where it'll just send your email in support. So that's something really easy you can do. I mean, in terms of wildlife trade in general, I think just thinking about where your products come from is a big one. I just did a story for National Geographic about illegal wildlife products turning up in the luxury fashion industry. And these are, really trusted brands that you could walk into Macy's and buy, things like Gucci or Ralph Lauren. And it's just because there's so little accountability on the supply chain of where these animals come from. So, you might think your snakeskin boots or bag that you pay thousands of dollars for is legally sourced, but you can't be 100% sure. So, if possible, wean yourself away from those products, or make sure you only buy products whose provenance you're 100% sure of. If you have the means, you can donate to conservation organizations. That's a huge one right now, because the conservation industry has just been absolutely hammered by COVID-19. People aren't donating as much, and people more so are not traveling. People aren't going and spending those tourist dollars in Africa, and it's taking salaries away from rangers, and it's going to have real impact. So if you can write a check, that's a really great way to help.
Can reintroduction of captive bred tigers from certified zoos ever be an important part of conserving the few thousand tigers left in the wild?
I mean, if they're purebred, that could be, but honestly, like, that's not what we need to save tigers. What we need to save tigers is to save their habitats and to stop poaching them in the wild, because tigers are cats and they breed like cats. If you just leave a tiger alone, it will have kittens, every year or so, and it will quickly repopulate, which is the case we've seen in India with tigers come surging back as long as they're given the space they need. So really, countries just need to invest in habitat and stopping that poaching.
There's been a lull.
Okay.
You can take a
Cool.
breath.
Yeah.
We'll give
Nice.
it one more minute and see. Oh,
Okay,
here we
great.
go. How do countries determine which wildlife species are legal and illegal to trade? It's a good question.
Yeah, great. So there's an international treaties called the Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna. I think I got that right, CITES. And CITES was established in the 70s by the UN, and CITES is composed of almost every, representatives from almost every country on the planet who set limits on which species can and can't be traded internationally. So internationally, we have a very well-defined list of many species about which ones can and can't. Domestically, it's just up to a country. Hopefully it would be done based on science, like we do here in the US with our Endangered Species Act. A lot of countries actually have really strong wildlife laws. Indonesia has some great laws, Vietnam does. The question though is whether they actually enforce those laws, if they're just paper laws or something that are enforced in the field.
I'm going to give everybody just a minute to see if anyone has any more questions.
Cool. I'm drinking LaCroix, by the way, not beer. That's for later.
Okay, everybody. I want to thank you so much, Rachel, for being with us this week. We're so happy that we could have you back again. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week at next week's Tyson seminar.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for joining.